Imagine you are the CEO of a major European airline right now. You are sitting in a boardroom. It's late March 2026, and you're staring at this spreadsheet that it fundamentally breaks your entire business model.
Yeah, it's a nightmare scenario.
Right, because you are legally required by European regulators to buy this highly specific type of synthetic aviation fuel. But the problem is this fuel barely exists on a commercial scale.
Barely exists, and it's incredibly expensive.
Exactly. It costs up to 5 times more than standard jet fuel. And thanks to this kinetic geopolitical supply chain war currently raging in the Middle East, the price of whatever tiny fraction of this fuel actually does exist, it's just spiked another $200 a ton in the last 30 days.
It is the absolute definition of a systemic collision. I mean, for years, we have mapped out the energy transition on these beautifully designed PowerPoint slides at climate summits.
Yeah, always perfectly smooth.
Right, the models always showed these smooth, graceful curves just pointing downward towards zero emissions. But when you actually step out of the conference hall and into the physical reality of global logistics, those smooth lines just completely shatter.
They don't exist in the real world.
No, they don't. We are witnessing the exact moment where sweeping top-down decarbonization mandates are slamming headfirst into hard thermodynamics, brutal margin economics, and the visceral shock of actual geopolitical warfare.
And that is exactly what we are unpacking today on the Deep Dive. And you, listening to this right now, you are the crucial third member of this conversation. Today, we are looking at the raw reality of the global energy transition in the final weeks of March 2026.
The boots on the ground reality.
Right. We are examining what happens when the unstoppable force of government mandates meets the immovable object of global supply chains. Because we've got heavy industry scrambling to avoid massive border taxes, airlines are in open revolt, consumer gas prices are climbing, and nations are trying to use agricultural policy as a shield against foreign wars.
It's a lot. And to understand the volatility of this specific moment, I think we really have to look at the macro structure first.
Okay, let's unpack this. Where do we start?
Well, the chaos we're seeing in aviation and consumer pricing, it's a direct reaction to the sheer, almost incomprehensible scale of the structural changes being forced into the global economy by the world's largest powers. I mean, we're looking at a fundamental rewiring of the entire industrial base.
So let's start with the titans of that rewiring. If we are talking about physical reality, we have to look at China's 15th five-year plan, which just dropped. The data point here is staggering. In 2025 alone, China added 446 gigawatts of renewable capacity.
You really need to pause and unpack the physical reality of 446 gigawatts.
Because it's a number so big, it almost loses its meaning.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Human brains are not naturally wired to comprehend that scale in a single 12-month period. That single-year addition about China exceeds the renewable capacity added by the rest of the entire world combined.
Just to put that in perspective for anyone trying to visualize this, that is not just, throwing up some solar panels on a roof. Building 446 gigawatts is the equivalent of constructing an entirely new power grid capable of running a continent the size of South America from scratch in a single year.
Right. The physical logistics are wild.
You have to mine the raw materials, manufacture the photovoltaics, forge the structural steel for wind turbine towers, lay thousands of miles of high-voltage transmission lines, and then you have to physically integrate all of this into a living, breathing electrical grid without causing massive blackouts.
It's a modern engineering marvel, truly. But what's fascinating here is that the most critical part of the 15th five-year plan is not actually the electricity itself.
Wait, really?
Yeah, it's what they intend to do with it. The mandate explicitly calls for a fundamental pivot. They are extending the green hydrogen industrial chain directly into green ammonia, methanol, and sustainable aviation fuel.
So this is a massive shift. We are moving from an electron-based conversation to a molecule-based conversation. Why is that pivot so crucial?
Well, because electrons are notoriously difficult to store and transport over vast distances, right? I mean, you cannot put a gigawatt of electricity on a cargo ship and send it to Europe.
Right. You'd need a very long extension cord.
Exactly. But molecules are nature's batteries. So China is taking this tidal wave of renewable electricity and using it for electrolysis. They're literally splitting water molecules to extract pure hydrogen.
And green hydrogen is basically the foundational building block of a post-carbon industrial economy.
Exactly. Once you have cheap green hydrogen, you can synthesize green ammonia, That's critical because it replaces the fossil fuel-derived ammonia we currently use for the fertilizers that, feed half the planet.
Right.
You can synthesize green methanol, which is the exact fuel the global shipping industry is desperate for right now. And you can create sustainable aviation fuel.
So they are essentially turning their solar and wind farms into massive chemical manufacturing plants. And they are putting a very specific, very aggressive price target on this. The plan targets a hydrogen cost of 25 yuan per kilogram by 2030, which translates to roughly $3.50 in U.S. currency.
That $3.50 target is, it's a potential earthquake for global manufacturing.
Yeah.
Producing green hydrogen right now is incredibly expensive.
It's a premium product.
Exactly. It's boutique. It's hindered by the high capital cost of electrolyzers and the massive amounts of energy required. But if China's state-directed manufacturing base can scale electrolyzer production the same way they scale solar panels,
Which they absolutely dominated.
right, if they force that cost curve down to $3.50 a kilogram within 4 years, it fundamentally alters the calculus for heavy industry globally.
Walk me through that calculus. Like, how does cheap hydrogen in China actually affect a manufacturer sitting in Germany or the U.S.?
It dictates who owns the manufacturing base of the 21st century. Think about heavy industries like steelmaking. They'd currently rely on metallurgical coal to reduce iron ore. If you want to make green steel, you need cheap green hydrogen to replace that coal.
Okay, makes sense.
So if China can provide that hydrogen at $3.50 a kilogram, while it costs, say, $7 or $8 in Europe, then the center of gravity for green steel production, and by extension, all the automotive and construction supply chains that rely on it.
It just shifts decisively to Asia.
Decisively.
Yeah.
This is an aggressive, coordinated industrial strategy to monopolize the manufacturing of clean molecules. And it's tied directly to their broader mandate of a 17% carbon intensity reduction between 2026 and 2030.
So China is using the heavy hand of state directives to physically force the price of molecules down through sheer scale. Now, let's look at how the West is responding to this, specifically Europe, because their approach is entirely different.
Oh, completely different.
European industry has just submitted nearly 10 billion euros in bids for the EU Innovation Fund 2025 auctions.
Right. And the contrast here is the difference between state-directed industrial policy and market incentive bureaucracy. The EU Innovation Fund is essentially a massive mechanism designed to de-risk green investments for private industry.
Using carbon pricing revenue, right?
Exactly.
Yep.
It uses revenue generated from the EU's carbon pricing system to fund innovative low-carbon technologies.
And the industrial appetite for this money is absolutely ravenous. I mean, 10 billion euros in project proposals. That covers a massive scope of the economy. We are talking about industrial decarbonization, retrofitting traditional manufacturing, scaling up renewable fuels.
And a massive push for CCUS carbon capture, utilization, and storage.
Right, which is huge.
It is. And the focus on CCUS in these bids is highly revealing about the physical limitations of the transition, because certain industries literally cannot stop emitting carbon, even if they run on 100% renewable electricity.
Right, like cement manufacturing, for example.
Yes, perfect example. The core process of making cement involves heating limestone calcium carbonate to extract calcium oxide. That chemical reaction, called calcination, inherently releases carbon dioxide. The rock itself breathes out CO2.
So even if you heat the kiln with a nuclear reactor or a massive solar farm, you're just creating massive carbon emissions just through the basic chemistry of the materials.
Exactly. You can't avoid it. So for those industries, the only physical solution is to capture the carbon dioxide directly from the smokestack before it hits the atmosphere.
And then what? Compress it.
Compress it and pump it deep underground into geological formations. But it is an incredibly capital-intensive, technologically complex process. Private companies are really hesitant to bet their balance sheets on a technology that produces no new revenue. I mean, it only prevents a penalty.
Right. It doesn't make the cement any better or more valuable. It just stops you from getting fined.
Exactly. That is why they are clamoring for these Innovation Fund grants. They need the public money to absorb the initial capital shock.
But here is where the European strategy seems deeply, fundamentally vulnerable. These proposals, this 10 billion euros worth of bids, were just submitted. But the final grant agreements are not expected to actually land in the bank accounts of these companies until the fourth quarter of 2026.
The timeline is brutal.
So wait, if I am a European green hydrogen startup, I have to spend months drafting a massive application, submit it, and then I wait almost a year for bureaucratic review, compliance checks, and regulatory approvals before I can even break ground.
That is the inherent friction of the European model.
Mm.
It relies on fostering a competitive ecosystem, theoretically ensuring that public money only goes to the most efficient, viable technologies. But like you said, you're waiting a year just for a signature.
It seems like they are trying to lay the track while driving the train, but first, they need to form a committee to study the metallurgy of the rails.
That's a great way to put it.
Meanwhile, in that same time frame, a Chinese state-backed enterprise has already broken ground, built the facility, and plugged it into that 446-gigawatt grid. So
Yeah.
what does this all mean? Is throwing 10 billion euros into a slow-moving grant process actually agile enough to compete with a coordinated top-down blitz?
The structural sluggishness of the grant process is exactly what European industrial leaders are warning about. Bureaucracy assumes a stable environment. It assumes you have time to review applications, disperse funds, and build infrastructure over a 5 to 10-year horizon.
Right. But we don't have a stable environment.
Not at all. That assumption of stability is exactly what is fracturing right now. Because while these long-term models are being debated in Brussels, the physical reality of the global supply chain is actively being disrupted by kinetic warfare.
Which brings us to the geopolitical wrench in the gears. We have massive plans and massive funds, but the outbreak of the Iran war has completely altered the immediate timeline.
Completely.
6 major U.S. trade associations are urgently lobbying the Trump administration to immediately finalize the 2026-2027 Renewable Fuel Standard, or the RFS. And the argument they are making is, well, it's fascinating.
It really is.
Just to be clear, we are just looking at the mechanics of these arguments here impartially, right? We're not taking political sides on the administration or the war itself. But objectively, these trade groups are not walking into the Oval Office talking about carbon emissions or climate goals.
No, not at all.
They are arguing that the Iran war is actively threatening global diesel supplies, and they are pitching domestic biodiesel as a matter of urgent national security.
This is a critical pivot in how the energy transition is being leveraged politically. The Renewable Fuel Standard is a highly complex policy tool. It's been around for decades. It essentially requires transportation fuel refiners to blend a certain volume of renewable fuels like ethanol or biodiesel into the nation's fuel supply.
And how do they track that?
Refiners prove compliance by acquiring Renewable Identification Numbers, or RINs. These function as a tradable commodity. The EPA sets the required volumes every year, and the pending rule for 2026-2027, which is expected by month end, is expected to be the most aggressive in the policy's 26-year history.
The irony here is just, it's so thick you could cut it with a knife. You have a kinetic conflict in the Middle East, a region historically defined by its dominance over fossil fuels. And the supply chain shock from this traditional oil state conflict is being utilized by agricultural trade groups as the primary catalyst to accelerate a domestic green mandate.
That's incredible.
They're essentially framing Midwestern biodiesel not as a climate initiative, but as a strategic domestic reserve.
It is a masterful, opportunistic lobbying strategy.
Mm-hmm.
The trade groups are pointing to the vulnerability of the Strait of Hormuz and the fragility of seaborne crude logistics and presenting a domestically grown, domestically refined alternative.
Yeah.
They are claiming the U.S. biodiesel industry is ready to meet 3% of total U.S. diesel demand right now.
Let's really look at that 3% claim, though, because 3% of U.S. diesel demand is physically a massive volume of liquid.
Right.
We're talking about millions of gallons, which requires a vast amount of agricultural land, specialized soybean crush facilities, and massive biorefineries. But as a buffer against a global macroeconomic shock, is 3% actually meaningful?
Meaningful in what sense?
Like, if the Iran conflict severely chokes off crude supplies and the global crack spread, the margin between the price of crude oil and the price of refined products like diesel blows up, sending diesel prices skyrocketing by 40 or 50%, does a 3% domestic buffer actually insulate the logistics industry?
In short, no. It operates as a shock absorber, but a remarkably thin one. If you have a severe supply disruption that pulls millions of barrels of crude out of the global daily market, the price of diesel at the pump in the United States will still surge dramatically.
So it doesn't stop the pain?
No. A 3% domestic baseline ensures that critical domestic infrastructure, say emergency services or vital food logistics, might have a guaranteed domestic supply line. But it will not save the broader economy from the inflationary pain of a global energy shock.
It is like having a backup battery for your house that only powers the refrigerator.
That's a perfect analogy.
Yes, your food doesn't spoil, which is critical, but you are still sitting in the dark, the heat is off, and you are very much experiencing a blackout.
And the secondary impacts of scaling that 3% are immense. I mean, if you rapidly mandate higher volumes of biodiesel, you are pulling raw agricultural commodities like soybean oil away from the global food market and funneling them into fuel tanks.
Which inevitably drives up food prices.
Exactly. It creates a completely different kind of inflationary pressure. The trade groups understand the limitations of their scale, which is why they are using the immediate panic of the war to forcefully lock in structurally higher permanent mandates. They know that once a mandate is established in the RFS, it is incredibly difficult to roll back.
So they are using the chaos of the geopolitical moment to permanently expand their market share under the banner of national security. But while the U.S. biodiesel industry sees this war as an opportunity to secure mandates across the Atlantic, similar mandates are creating an absolute nightmare for industries that don't have a domestic agricultural base to fall back on.
You are referring to the margin squeeze in European aviation, which is, frankly, perhaps the most visceral example of regulatory models colliding with physical reality in our analysis today.
The numbers here are just brutal. We touched on this at the start. Western Europe Sustainable Aviation Fuel, or F, has surged to $2,500 per ton. That is a $200 spike from just a month ago in February.
And this surge is directly correlated to the Middle East supply chain disruptions caused by the Iran war.
Right. And here's where it gets really interesting. To understand the panic in the aviation industry, you have to look at the baseline economics of flying. Airlines operate on notoriously razor-thin margins. Fuel is consistently their single largest operating expense.
It dictates everything.
Yes. The entire business model, route planning, ticket pricing, yield management, is highly sensitive to the global price of conventional jet fuel, which is derived from crude oil.
And conventional jet fuel is already expensive and volatile. But SAF is a completely different beast. Even before this war, SAF was costing airlines 3 to 5 times more than conventional fuel.
And now, a war has disrupted the shipping lanes that deliver the feedstocks required to make it, spiking the price even further.
Right. And yet, despite the astronomical cost and the supply chain fragility, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the global supply of SAF currently makes up roughly 0.3% of all aviation fuel used worldwide.
Wait, 0.3%?
Yes, it is a statistical rounding error. It is a boutique product.
It barely exists. So if I'm an airline CEO and I look at the European Union mandates demanding that I use 2% SAF by 2025, which is literally next year, and 6% by 2030, how do I possibly make that math work? I am legally required to buy massive volumes of a fuel that doesn't physically exist at scale at a price that destroys my operating margin.
That impossible math is precisely what has triggered a full-blown CEO revolt. European airline executives are actively organizing to challenge a highly specific, highly controversial subclause of this mandate: the EU's requirement for 1.2% synthetic DSF by 2030.
Okay, let's break down the chemistry here, because the distinction between regular SAF and synthetic eSAF is the core of this revolt. What makes synthetic eSAF so uniquely problematic?
Well, standard SAF is typically produced through a process called EFA. This uses biological feedstocks, things like used cooking oil, waste animal fats, or agricultural residue.
Okay.
The problem there is scalability. There is a hard physical limit to how much used cooking oil the world produces. You cannot run the global aviation industry on French fry grease.
Right. Eventually you run out of waste.
Exactly. So regulators looked at synthetic eSAF as the ultimate, infinitely scalable solution. It is also known as power-to-liquid fuel.
How does that work?
The process works like this. You take renewable electricity, you use it in an electrolyzer to produce green hydrogen. Then you capture carbon dioxide, either directly from the ambient air or from an industrial smokestack.
Okay, so you have hydrogen and carbon.
Right. Finally, you combine that green hydrogen and that captured carbon in a chemical reactor using the Fischer-Tropsch process to synthesize a liquid hydrocarbon that perfectly mimics jet fuel.
I mean, that sounds like a technological miracle. You are literally making jet fuel out of thin air and sunshine.
It is a chemical marvel, but it's a thermodynamic nightmare.
Why?
Because every single step in that process, the electrolysis, the carbon capture, the chemical synthesis, involves a massive energy penalty. You lose a huge percentage of your initial renewable energy just converting it from an electron into a liquid molecule.
So you lose energy just to make the energy.
Exactly. The sheer volume of raw electricity required to produce a single gallon of synthetic ESF is staggering. Because of this massive energy requirement and the early stage of the technology, commercial-scale production facilities are practically non-existent right now.
So to summarize the airline CEO's nightmare, Regulators in Brussels, looking at a spreadsheet a few years ago, decided to legally mandate that by 2030, airlines must purchase and burn a specific percentage of a fuel that has a massive thermodynamic penalty.
Yep.
It costs a fortune to synthesize, barely exists outside of small pilot plants, and relies on supply chains currently being squeezed by a war in the Middle East.
That is the exact disconnect between the conference hall and the tarmac. The regulatory philosophy here is to use a legal mandate as a hammer to force a market into existence.
Build it and they will come, basically.
Right. The theory is that if you legally guarantee the demand, investors will flood capital into SAF refineries, the technology will scale, and the price will eventually fall.
But the airlines are saying they will go bankrupt before that cost curve ever comes down. If they are forced to buy fuel at $2,500 a ton, they have to pass that cost on to the consumer. Does the EU just expect airlines to implement a massive ticket hike, effectively making air travel prohibitively expensive for the middle class, just to satisfy a mandate for a fuel that the market hasn't figured out how to produce efficiently yet?
The airlines are arguing that rapid decarbonization timelines constructed during the low inflation, relatively stable geopolitical environment of the early 2020s are fundamentally broken in the high inflation, fragmented reality of 2026. The physical infrastructure simply cannot scale as fast as the legal text demands.
It is a brutal collision. But this regulatory hammer isn't just swinging at the aviation sector. These exact same pressures mandates, border taxes, consumer price hikes, they're falling squarely on traditional heavy industries and everyday citizens this very month.
Oh, absolutely. We're witnessing a historic restructuring of global trade mechanics right now.
Yeah.
On March 31st, 2026, the European border tax, officially known as the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM, enters its final, fully operational phase.
And the deadline is literally days away. The mechanism is incredibly stringent. Any company importing more than 50 tons of CBAM-covered goods annually into the European Union must obtain an authorized CBAM declarant status by March 31st.
To understand the gravity of this deadline, you have to look at the transition period leading up to it. For the last few years, CBAM has been in a trial phase.
Like a practice run.
Exactly. Importers could use default estimated values to report the carbon emissions embedded in the steel, cement, aluminum, fertilizers, electricity, and hydrogen they brought into Europe. It was largely a paperwork exercise designed to get supply chains used to the idea of carbon tracking.
But as of March 31st, the trial is over.
The default estimates are gone entirely.
So what replaces them?
Real, highly scrutinized, verified emissions data is now legally required for every shipment. And more importantly, the financial toll begins. Companies importing these foundational goods must now purchase CBAM certificates to cover the embedded carbon.
And how is the price of those certificates determined? I mean, it's not just a flat fee, right?
No, and this is where it gets incredibly complex. The price of a CBAM certificate is tied directly to the quarterly average pricing of the EU emissions trading system, the EU ETS.
Okay, remind me how the ETS works.
The ETS is a cap-and-trade market where European industrial facilities buy and sell allowances to emit carbon. Because the total number of allowances is capped and reduced every year, the price of emitting carbon within Europe fluctuates based on market demand.
So, by pegging the border tax to the ETS, Europe is essentially forcing foreign manufacturers to pay the exact same floating, market-driven carbon price that domestic European manufacturers pay.
Precisely. It is an anti-dumping mechanism. Think about it. If a European steel plant spends €1 billion retrofitting their facility to run on green hydrogen, their production costs skyrocket.
Right.
If there was no border tax, a competitor in India or China could just use cheap coal to make steel, ship it to Europe, undercut the green steel on price, and bankrupt the European manufacturer.
That makes total sense.
CBAM acts as an equalizer. When that cheap, dirty steel hits the European port, the importer has to buy enough CBAM certificates to match the EU carbon price, instantly wiping out the cost advantage of using coal.
Okay, I want to try to visualize the supply chain chaos this causes. Think of it like trying to enforce a strict dietary restriction at a massive neighborhood potluck.
Okay.
Europe is standing at the door, aggressively interrogating the recipe of every single dish anyone brings inside. If you want to bring your casserole into the party, you have to provide an audited, verified list of exactly how much butter and sugar went into it.
Right.
And if it exceeds the limit, you have to pay a massive cover charge right there on the porch before you can set it on the table.
That is an excellent way to visualize it. And the supply chain chaos this creates is staggering. Imagine you're an importer in Germany. You rely on aluminum components from a supplier in India.
Okay.
It is no longer enough to just negotiate the price and the shipping date. You now have to demand that your Indian supplier trace their Scope 3 emissions back to the electrical grid that powered their smelter. You need an audited carbon ledger that is as robust as their financial ledger.
Wow. And if that supplier can't provide the data, or if you, the importer, miss this March 31st deadline to become an authorized declarant?
Your goods do not enter the European Union. They are stopped at customs. You face actual physical border delays and massive financial penalties. We are elevating carbon accounting to the exact same level of legal and economic liability as traditional financial accounting in global trade.
But that fundamentally rewrites the competitive advantage of global manufacturing.
It does.
It is a massive bureaucratic wall designed to protect the European market from carbon leakage. But while Europe is building walls to tax heavy industry at the border, we also have to look at what happens when the massive, unavoidable cost of this transition hits the everyday consumer directly, because it is no longer abstract. It is hitting the wallet right now.
We can see this friction clearly in the intelligence regarding Canada's clean fuel regulations, and this raises an important question about public tolerance. The regulations are directly driving up the cost of consumer transportation. The data projects gas price increases of 4 to 6 cents per liter in 2026.
And it does not stop there. The Parliamentary Budget Officer in Canada is projecting escalating compliance costs as the carbon intensity targets tighten year over year. They forecast this hidden cost will reach 13 cents per liter by 2030.
That's a significant jump.
It is. That is a highly visible, highly irritating cost increase for every single person who drives to work, drops their kids at school, or buys groceries delivered by a diesel truck.
This touches on the fundamental political tension of the energy transition. Because in systems like the Canadian federal carbon tax, there is a rebate mechanism designed to return money to citizens to offset the visible cost of the carbon price.
Right, you get a check in the mail.
Exactly. But the clean fuel regulations operate differently. They require refiners and importers to reduce the carbon intensity of their fuels. The refiners achieve this by blending more expensive biofuels or buying credits, and they pass those compliance costs directly down to the pump.
So no rebate.
There is no consumer rebate for the clean fuel regulations. It is a pure, unmitigated cost increase absorbed by the end user.
And the political friction is boiling over. We are seeing a critical deadline approaching on April 1st for a memorandum of understanding between the provincial government of Alberta and the federal government in Ottawa regarding carbon pricing fixes. Now, again, to be strictly impartial, we are observing this just as an analytical reality of the transition.
Right, it's just the data.
But you have a massive structural tension between a federal government mandating national decarbonization timelines and a provincial economy that is deeply, historically intertwined with traditional oil and gas production.
And that friction between Alberta and Ottawa is really a microcosm of the global struggle. When decarbonization was a distant, abstract target for 2050, it enjoyed broad public support. But actually achieving those targets requires the physical demolition and rebuilding of the global energy infrastructure.
Which requires trillions of dollars in capital.
Trillions. And inevitably, whether through direct taxes, border tariffs, or regulatory compliance costs, that massive capital requirement flows downstream to the consumer.
Which begs the ultimate political question. How much public tolerance actually exists for a 13-cent per liter price hike when inflation is already squeezing the middle class and global stability feels incredibly fragile?
It's a very difficult sell.
We see airline CEOs revolting against mandates that will force ticket prices up, and we see massive friction between regional and federal governments over the cost of fuel. It is the physical world and the consumer wallet aggressively resisting the pace of mandated change.
Exactly. The transition is not a smooth curve on a graph. It is a grinding, expensive, politically volatile rewiring of the physical economy.
Which is why our final area of analysis today is so incredibly compelling. Because while the aviation sector freezes under the weight of impossible mandates and heavy industry scrambles to avoid border declarations, the global shipping industry is executing a fascinating, highly pragmatic workaround.
They really are navigating the chaos with a completely different strategy.
Yeah. The maritime sector is offering a masterclass in technological risk management during a volatile transition. A recent maritime brief details that the French shipping giant CMA CGM is rapidly expanding its alternative fuel fleet.
Right. They recently added a massive new container ship called the CMA CGM Carmen.
And this brings us full circle right back to Act 1. The Carmen is a methanol dual-fuel container ship. Suddenly, China's massive push to scale green methanol production in their 15th five-year plan makes aggressive, logical sense.
It does.
China is building the chemical plants to manufacture green methanol because global shipping titans are physically launching the vessels right now that are designed to burn it. They are creating the supply because the maritime industry is securing the demand.
They're building the infrastructure in tandem. But the absolute brilliance of CMA CGM strategy and the broader approach being adopted across the shipping industry lies entirely in the engineering of that term, dual fuel.
Let's analyze the mechanics of that. Why is a dual-fuel marine engine such a game-changer compared to the corner the airlines are painted into?
Because it is the ultimate hedge against systemic volatility. A dual-fuel marine engine is designed with separate injection systems. It can burn a green alternative like methanol when it is available and economically viable. But it retains the ability to burn conventional, heavy maritime fuel oil.
It's essentially an options contract on the future of energy.
That is precisely what it is.
Yeah.
A shipping company pays a premium upfront to install a dual-fuel engine. They are buying the option to use whatever fuel makes the most sense at any given port on any given day.
That's incredibly smart.
It is. If green methanol is completely unavailable in a specific region, or if a geopolitical shock like the Iran war drives the price of alternative fuels to an astronomical premium, exactly what we are seeing happen with aviation SAF, the ship does not stop.
The supply chain does not freeze.
Exactly. The captain simply switches the injection system over to conventional fuel and keeps moving.
Compare that to the airlines. An airline mandated to buy synthetic SAF that doesn't exist at a viable price is trapped. A plane's jet engines cannot just seamlessly switch to burning heavy fuel oil if the green stuff gets too expensive.
No, the physics of commercial aviation, extreme weight constraints, aerodynamic limitations, stringent safety margins, require an exact drop-in liquid replacement. You cannot bolt a massive, heavy, flexible fuel storage system onto a Boeing 777.
But the physics of a cargo ship absolutely allow for it. A massive container ship has the structural capacity to house separate tanks for methanol and conventional fuel, and the space to accommodate a massive two-stroke dual-fuel engine.
Right. The sheer scale of maritime engineering allows for economic pragmatism that aviation cannot access. If the green fuel is viable, the shipping company burns it, reduces their carbon footprint, and meets their emissions targets.
And if the global market goes crazy,
They flip a switch, burn conventional fuel, pay whatever carbon penalty is required, and keep the global economy functioning.
and that pragmatism, that ability to mitigate existential risk, is leading to explosive growth. The intelligence points to a staggering projection from the maritime fuel software company Affinity. They project that in 2026, alternative fuel volumes in the maritime sector will grow by 10x 10 times over 2025 volumes.
A 10x growth rate in a heavy industrial sector in a single year is a hockey stick curve. It proves that when heavy industry is given a technological pathway that allows for scaling without betting the entire survival of the company on an immature, highly volatile fuel market, the transition can actually move incredibly fast.
Shipping is decarbonizing through sheer, flexible engineering, while aviation is choking on rigid mandates.
Well said.
So we have pulled apart this entire sprawling landscape of the March 2026 energy transition. We've gone from the massive grids of China to the custom offices of Europe, the fuel tanks of Midwestern tractors, the boardrooms of European airlines, and the engine rooms of French container ships.
It's a massive shift. And if we synthesize the mechanics of everything we have discussed today, we are witnessing a profoundly asymmetric, deeply fragmented global transition.
Fragmented is the perfect word.
Right. On one side, you have the incredible, almost terrifying top-down capacity building in Asia, specifically China, treating the green molecule as the next great industrial monopoly. You have Europe attempting to force a market shift through massive bureaucratic mechanisms, complex grants, and rigid border tax restructuring.
And then the wars.
Right. You have the inherent fragility of legacy fossil fuel supply chains violently exposed by the kinetic war in Iran. And across all of these pressure points, you see wildly varying reactions. The desperate panic of the heavily constrained aviation sector, the opportunistic lobbying of the agricultural sector, and the brilliant, flexible pragmatism of global shipping.
And for you, listening to this deep dive, understanding the interplay of these forces gives you a massive advantage. When you watch the news, or when you book a flight and see a fuel surcharge, or when you notice the price of imported goods creeping up, you now have the ability to see the matrix underneath.
You can see the whole picture.
Exactly. You can see exactly how global energy policy, the physical thermodynamics of synthesizing jet fuel, military conflicts in the Middle East, and the price of a gallon of gas in Canada are all tightly, inextricably braided together.
None of these events happen in a vacuum.
No. A mandate in Brussels impacts a smelter in India. A war in Iran impacts a soybean farmer in the Midwest.
They are deeply structurally bound to one another. And as we conclude our analysis today, I want to leave you with a final thought to consider, a concept that builds on the realities we've uncovered.
Let's hear it.
We have seen how alternative fuels, biodiesel in the U.S., synthetic SAF in Europe, are increasingly being framed not just as environmental necessities, but as critical instruments of national security designed to insulate economies from foreign conflicts.
Right. We are seeing the early stages of nations trying to build strategic green reserves.
Exactly. So the question we must ask as we look toward the 2030s is this. As the century progresses and the transition accelerates, will the major geopolitical struggles, the trade wars, and the kinetic conflicts of the future be fought not over access to underground oil and gas reserves, but over the raw supply chains, the proprietary manufacturing technologies, and the sheer overwhelming volume of renewable electricity required to manufacture these critical green molecules?
That's a chilling thought.
Are we simply shifting the geography of global conflict from the oil well to the electrolyzer?
It is a profound shift in how power will be leveraged globally. The era of the smooth, predictable transition chart is over. The messy, chaotic geopolitical reality is here. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the physical mechanics of the future. We will see you next time.